I'm Derek Lawson, 45, and I've spent more than half my adult life behind bars for a crime I didn't commit. 18 years of stolen birthdays, missed graduations, and a mother who died believing her son was a killer. Detective Frank Rourke destroyed my life with planted evidence and perjured testimony, but he made one fatal mistake. He got greedy. What I discovered about his web of corruption didn't just vindicate me. It brought down an entire network that had been destroying lives for decades. Sometimes justice doesn't just knock, it kicks down the door. If you've ever felt powerless against a corrupt system, like and subscribe for stories of truth, perseverance, and the sweet taste of vindication. Let me take you back to March 15th, 2005. I was 27 then, working double shifts at Joe's Diner on 5th Street, trying to scrape together enough money for my mother's medical bills. She'd been battling diabetes complications for years, and the treatments were bleeding us dry financially. That night, I clocked in at 6 p.m. for what would be my second shift of the day. I'd already worked the morning rush from 5 a.m. to noon. My work uniform from that night still exists somewhere in an evidence locker, stained with grease from the fryer and coffee from the endless pots I brewed. It should have been my salvation, proof of where I was when everything went to hell. The Westfield convenience store robbery happened at 9:47 p.m., according to the timestamp on the security footage. A masked gunman walked in, demanded cash from the register, and when 62-year-old store owner Kumar Patel moved too slowly, shot him twice. In the chest. Patel died before the ambulance arrived, leaving behind a wife and 3 children. At 9:47 p.m., I was exactly where I'd been for the previous 3 hours and 47 minutes. Behind the counter at Joe's Diner, serving coffee to truckers and taking orders from the late-night crowd. The diner security cameras captured me. In frame after frame, my movements documented by the hour. I had timesheets signed by my manager, receipt timestamps, and at least 6 regular customers who could vouch for my presence. When Detective Frank Rourke first showed up at my apartment at 6 a.m. the next morning, I actually felt relieved. Finally, someone was taking the robbery seriously. I invited him in, offered him coffee, and answered every question with complete honesty. Why wouldn't I? I had nothing to hide. Rourke was a big man with graying hair and tired eyes that seemed to look right through you. He wore a rumpled suit that had seen better days and spoke in a gravelly voice that commanded attention. When he asked about my whereabouts the previous evening, I walked him through my entire shift minute by minute. You seem pretty confident about your timeline, he said, scribbling notes in a small pad. It's not confidence, detective. It's facts. I was at work from 6 p.m. until 2 a.m. I've got documentation for every hour, but something in his expression troubled me. Instead of the relief I expected when I provided my airtight alibi, Rourke's face remained stone cold. He asked to see my work clothes from the night before the uniform that should have cleared me of any suspicion. We'll need to take this for testing, he said, bagging the uniform despite its obvious innocence. Standard procedure. 3 days later, Rourke returned with a warrant and 3 other officers. I was having breakfast with my mother when the pounding started on our door. She was so weak from her latest round of treatments that the sudden noise sent her into a panic. Derek Lawson, you're under arrest for the armed robbery and murder of Kumar Patel. The words hit me like a physical blow. Murder? The room started spinning as Rourke read me my rights. My mother collapsed into her wheelchair, sobbing as they put the handcuffs on me. I kept repeating the same words over and over. There's been a mistake. Check the tapes. Check the diner. I wasn't there. But Rourke just smiled, a cold, calculating expression that I'd see in my nightmares for years to come. We'll let the evidence speak for itself. As they led me away, I caught a glimpse of my mother's face in the window. The devastation in her eyes was something I'd never forget. She raised me to believe in truth, justice, and the fundamental goodness of people. In that moment, watching her son being arrested for murder, I could see that faith beginning to crumble. I was 27 years old, I had never been arrested before, and I truly believed that this was all just a terrible misunderstanding that would be cleared up within hours. After all, I had security footage, timesheets, witnesses, everything needed to prove my innocence. How naive I was. 2 weeks after my arrest, Detective Rourke made his next move. I was sitting in a holding cell, still clinging to the belief that my public defender would straighten everything out, when the news hit like a sledgehammer. We found the murder weapon in your apartment, Rourke announced during what I thought was a routine questioning session. He slid a photograph across the metal table, a .38 caliber revolver with the serial number B4471 clearly visible. My hands started shaking. That's impossible. I've never owned a gun in my life. My mother can tell you she hates firearms. There's never been a weapon in our apartment. Rourke's expression remained unchanged. Funny thing about this gun, Derek, ballistics confirmed. It's the same weapon used to kill Kumar Patel. We found it wrapped in a towel under your bathroom sink. The room felt like it was closing in on me. You planted it. You had to have planted it. That's a serious accusation, Rourke said, but I caught something in his eyes, not anger at being accused, but satisfaction. Like he was enjoying watching me squirm. My court-appointed attorney, Charles Brennan, was a man in his late 50s who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. When I told him about the planted gun, he barely looked up from his notepad. Mr. Lawson, these kinds of conspiracy theories don't play well with juries. We need to focus on building a reasonable doubt defense. It's not a theory. Check the security footage from my building. Check for fingerprints on the gun. Run DNA test. Do something. Brennan sighed like I was asking him to move mountains. The budget for this case doesn't allow for extensive forensic testing. We need to work with what we have. What we had was disappearing fast. The diner security footage that clearly showed me working during the time of the murder. The hard drive had mysteriously corrupted, according to the police report. The timesheets that documented my presence. My manager at Joe's Diner suddenly couldn't remember seeing me that night, despite having signed off on my hours just days before. But the most devastating blow came when Kumar Patel's brother, Raj, identified me in a lineup. I stood there behind the one-way glass, knowing I'd never seen this man before in my life, watching him point directly at me. That's him. That's the man who killed my brother. Later, I learned through my lawyer's half-hearted investigation that Raj Patel had been struggling with gambling debts. Substantial ones. The kind that could ruin a man's life or motivate him to lie under oath. He seemed very certain, Brennan told me after the identification. Eyewitness testimony is powerful evidence. He's lying, I said. Or someone convinced him to lie. Can't you see what's happening here? But Brennan was already moving on to the next item on his checklist, treating my case like just another file to be processed rather than a man's life hanging in the balance. The evidence against me was building systematically, piece by piece. First the planted gun, then the disappeared alibi evidence, now a coached witness. Each element designed to create an airtight case against an innocent man. I started keeping my own notes, documenting every inconsistency, every suspicious coincidence. At night, in my cell, I'd write down everything I could remember about Detective Rourke's behavior, his questions, his reactions. Something told me that these details might matter someday. My mother visited me every day that she was physically able. The treatments had left her weak, but she never missed a chance to tell me she believed in my innocence. Her faith in me was the only thing keeping me sane. The truth will come out, baby, she'd whisper through the glass partition. God sees everything, I wanted to believe her. But as the evidence mounted and my trial date approached, I began to understand that truth and justice weren't the same thing. Someone had decided I would pay for Kumar Patel's murder, and they had the power to make it happen. The trial lasted exactly 1 week. 7 days to dismantle a life built on honesty and hard work. 7 days for 12 strangers to decide that I was a cold-blooded killer. My lawyer's opening statement lasted 12 minutes. The prosecution's took 45. Right there. I should have known which way the wind was blowing. District Attorney Monica Sheffield was everything. Charles Brennan wasn't prepared, articulate, and absolutely convinced of my guilt. She painted a picture of a desperate young man, overwhelmed by his mother's medical bills, who turned to robbery to solve his problems. When the robbery went wrong, she argued, I panicked and killed an innocent store owner. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she said during her closing argument, The evidence is overwhelming. The defendant's gun was used to murder Kumar Patel. The victim's brother identified him in a lineup. Derek Lawson may seem like a nice young man, but on the night of March 5th, 10th, he became a killer. Brennan's defense was pathetic by comparison. He mumbled something about reasonable doubt, mentioned that I had no prior criminal record, and spent more time apologizing to the jury for taking up their time than actually defending me. The prosecution presented their case with surgical precision. Detective Rourke took the stand and testified about finding the murder weapon in my apartment. His testimony was smooth, confident, and completely fabricated. When Brennan cross-examined him, Rourke's answers were so polished they sounded rehearsed. "Detective, isn't it unusual to find a murder weapon so easily?" Brennan asked. "Not at all," Rourke replied. "Criminals often keep evidence close to home. They think they're smarter than they are?" Raj Patel's testimony was the nail in my coffin. He looked directly at me when he spoke, his voice heavy with conviction and grief. I saw his face clearly when he demanded the money. Those eyes, I'll never forget those eyes. "That's the man who killed my brother." I wanted to scream that he was lying, that someone had paid him or threatened him or both, but all I could do was sit there and watch my life being destroyed by perjured testimony. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 15 minutes. Not even long enough to review all the evidence properly. When they returned, I could read the verdict in their faces before the foreman even spoke. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Derek Lawson, guilty of murder in the first degree," the courtroom erupted. My mother screamed cut through the noise like a knife through my heart. She collapsed right there in the gallery, her frail body crumpling as the bailiffs moved to restrain me. "No," I kept saying. "No, this isn't right. I didn't do this." But Judge Patricia Henley was already reaching for her gavel. She was a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair and cold eyes. During the trial, she'd ruled against every motion my lawyer made, no matter how reasonable. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice echoing through the suddenly quiet courtroom, "you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of the cold-blooded murder of Kumar Patel. This was a senseless crime that destroyed a family and shattered a community's sense of safety." She paused, looking directly at me with what seemed like personal satisfaction. "I hereby sentence you to 25 years to life in state prison. 25 to life." The words hit me like physical blows. I was 27 years old, and I had just been sentenced to spend the rest of my life behind bars for a crime I didn't commit. As the bailiffs led me away in shackles, I caught one last glimpse of my mother. She was being helped from the courtroom by my aunt, her face a mask of devastation and disbelief. In that moment, I realized that the man who had walked into that courtroom a week ago was gone forever. That night, in my cell at the county jail awaiting transfer to state prison, I made a promise to myself and to my mother's memory I would never stop fighting to prove my innocence. No matter how long it took, no matter what it cost me, I would find a way to expose the truth. I had no idea it would take 18 years. Millbrook Correctional Facility looked like something out of a nightmare. Concrete walls topped with razor wire, guard towers that watched your every move, and the constant sound of metal doors slamming shut. The bus ride there took 2 hours, during which I tried to prepare myself for what was coming. Nothing could have prepared me for the reality. The intake process was designed to strip away every shred of dignity you had left. They took my clothes, gave me a cavity search, and handed me a uniform with the number 47,291 printed on it. That number would define me for the next 18 years. My first cellmate was a man named Rico who'd been convicted of armed robbery. He looked me up and down when I walked into our 8x10 concrete box and made his assessment. "What you in for, college boy?" "Murder," I said, because in prison the truth was always better than appearing weak. Rico laughed. "You don't look like no killer. You sure you gonna make it in here?" I wasn't sure of anything anymore. The first week was the hardest of my life. The noise never stopped, men shouting, arguing, crying. The smell was a mixture of disinfectant, sweat, and desperation. Every meal was a potential confrontation, every shower a risk, every moment a test of survival. I learned quickly that claiming innocence was the worst thing you could do. Every convict in Millbrook was innocent, according to them. It made you Look naive, weak, like fresh meat for the predators who ruled the prison hierarchy. That's when I met Clarence Washington. Though everyone called him Old C, he was serving life without parole for a murder he'd committed 30 years earlier, but time had transformed him into something of a philosopher. At 68, he was one of the few men in Millbrook who commanded universal respect. "Young blood," he said to me one day in the library, "you got that look." "What look?" "The look of a man who thinks the world makes sense." Let me tell you something, fairness is a luxury you can't afford in here. You want to survive? You gotta learn the rules that actually matter, not the ones they wrote down on paper. Old C became my teacher, my protector, and eventually my closest friend. He taught me which guards could be trusted and which ones would sell you out for a cigarette. He showed me how to move through the prison without attracting the wrong kind of attention, how to eat my meals without starting a fight, and how to sleep at night despite the constant threat of violence. But the hardest lesson was learning to live with the knowledge that I was innocent while surrounded by men who assumed I was guilty. There were moments when I wanted to scream the truth to anyone who would listen, but Old C always pulled me back. Truth is a privilege, son. In here, survival comes first. 3 months into my sentence, I received the last letter I would ever get from my mother. Her handwriting was shakier than usual, and the paper was stained with what I knew were tears. "My dearest Derek," she wrote, "the doctors say the diabetes is winning. I want you to know that no matter what anyone says, no matter what any court decided, I know you are innocent. You are my good boy, and nothing will ever change that. Keep fighting, baby. Keep believing. The truth will come out someday." She died 2 weeks later while I was in solitary confinement for fighting with another inmate who had made comments about my mother. I missed her funeral, missed saying goodbye, missed holding her hand one last time. That night in solitary, staring at the concrete walls that would be my world for years to come, I made a decision that would define the rest of my time in prison. I would survive, but I would never stop believing in my innocence. And someday, somehow, I would prove it. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in November, 6 months into my sentence. I was sleeping fitfully when the guard's flashlight woke me up. "Lawson, warden wants to see you." At that hour, a summons from the warden could only mean one thing. I knew before I walked into his office that my mother was gone. Warden Hayes was a hard man who'd spent 30 years in corrections. He'd seen every kind of grief, delivered every type of bad news, but even he seemed affected by what he had to tell me. "I'm sorry, son. Your mother passed away 2 hours ago. Stroke, according to the hospital. The death certificate would later show the official cause as acute cerebrovascular accident, but I knew the truth. My mother died of a broken heart, alone in a hospital bed, still believing her son was a killer. The worst part wasn't just that she was gone, it was knowing that she died without ever learning the truth. For 18 months, she'd visited me every week that her health allowed, always insisting that justice would prevail, that God would reveal the truth. She never got to see that vindication. "There's something else," Warden Hayes continued. "Due to your recent disciplinary infractions, you're not eligible for compassionate leave to attend the funeral." The disciplinary infraction he was referring to was the fight I'd gotten into 3 days earlier. Another inmate, a piece of garbage named Torres, had made some crude comments about my mother during chow time. I'd put him in the infirmary with a broken nose and spent the next week in solitary confinement. "I need to be there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "She's my mother. I'm sorry. Rules are rules. Rules. Always the rules." The same rules that had allowed Detective Rourke to frame me, that had let a corrupt system destroy my life, that now prevented me from saying goodbye to the only person who'd never stopped believing in me. They put me back in solitary that night, not as punishment, but as protection. The guards knew that learning about my mother's death while surrounded by other inmates would either break me completely or turn me into something dangerous. Solitary confinement is designed to break your spirit. 23 hours a day in a windowless concrete box, 1 hour of exercise in a slightly larger concrete box, no human contact except for the guards who slid your food through a slot. It's psychological torture disguised as security. For 2 weeks I sat in that cell and contemplated ending it all. What was the point of living when everyone I loved was gone, when the system had stolen my freedom, when even death couldn't reunite me with my mother because I'd never see heaven with murder on my record? I had worked out the method. Prison guards. Check on you every 15 minutes during certain shifts, but there were gaps. I could fashion a noose from my bedsheets, tie it to the light fixture, and be gone before anyone found me. On the 14th night, I was sitting on my cot with the makeshift rope in my hands when I heard Old C's voice through the ventilation system. He was 3 cells down, and he'd been talking to me every night, even though it was against regulations. "Derek, you listening?" "Yeah." "Your mama's still believing in you right now. She up there waiting for you to prove what she always knew. You give up now? You make her faith meaningless?" I sat there in the dark, holding that rope, thinking about my mother's last letter and her absolute certainty that the truth would come out. She'd died believing in my innocence, but she'd also died believing that someday everyone would know it. That night, I made a different choice. I wouldn't live for freedom, that seemed impossible. I wouldn't live for happiness, that was gone forever. But I would live for vindication. I would live to prove that Martha Lawson raised a good son, not a killer. I destroyed the rope and settled in for the long fight ahead. After my mother's death, I threw myself into studying the law with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. The prison library became my second home, a cramped room filled with outdated legal texts and law books that other inmates had donated over the years. I started with the basics: criminal procedure, evidence rules, constitutional law. Every morning after breakfast, I'd claim the same corner table and spread out my handwritten notes. By evening, my fingers would be stained with ink from the cheap pens they sold in the commissary. The other inmates thought I was crazy. "Jailhouse lawyer," they called me, and not in a good way. Most of them had seen dozens of convicts waste years chasing impossible appeals, writing legal motions that got thrown out by judges who barely glanced at them, but Old C understood what I was doing. "You building something," he told me one day, as I worked through a case about wrongful convictions. "I can see it in your eyes. You building hope." He was right. Every page I read, every note I took, every case study I analyzed was another brick in the foundation of my eventual vindication. I wasn't just studying law, I was preparing for war. My handwritten legal notes grew into thousands of pages over the first 5 years. I documented everything: inconsistencies in the police reports, problems with the chain of evidence, witness statements that didn't add up. I drew diagrams of the crime scene, created timelines of the investigation, and mapped out every person who had been involved in my case. The correspondence I sent out during those years could have filled filing cabinets. I wrote to every Innocence Project in the country, every civil rights organization, every journalist who had ever covered wrongful convictions. Most letters went unanswered. The few responses I received were form letters politely declining to take my case. We receive thousands of claims of innocence each year, and can only take on cases with the strongest evidence of actual innocence. Strong evidence. I had security footage showing me at work during the murder, except that footage had mysteriously disappeared. I had witnesses who could vouch for my presence at the diner, except they'd suddenly developed amnesia or moved out of state. I had no criminal history, no motive, no connection to the victim, but I also had a gun with my alleged fingerprints and an eyewitness identification. Old C taught me patience during those frustrating years. Justice moves slow, young blood. But it moves, you just gotta keep pushing. He also taught me strategy. Don't just write to lawyers, he advised. Write to reporters, write to politicians. Write to anyone who might listen. Innocent men don't get free by accident, they get free because someone with power decides to pay attention. So I expanded my letter-writing campaign. I wrote to newspaper editors, television producers, local politicians, anyone who might have the influence to take a second look at my case. I learned to craft different types of letters, emotional appeals for the human interest stories, fact-based presentations for the legal minds, political arguments for the elected officials. Most of these letters ended up in trash cans, but I kept writing anyway. Somewhere out there was someone who would listen, someone who would care enough to dig deeper. In 2010, 5 years into my sentence, I finally received a response that gave me hope. A journalism student at the state university named Kevin Chun was working on a project about wrongful convictions and wanted to interview me for his thesis. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time since my conviction, someone was actively investigating my claims of innocence. "Tell me everything," Kevin said during our first phone interview. "Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." I talked for 3 hours straight, walking him through every detail of my case, every inconsistency, every red flag. Kevin took notes, asked intelligent questions, and most importantly, he believed me. "Your story has problems," he told me at the end of our conversation. "But the problems are with the investigation, not with your version of events. I want to keep digging." That night, for the first time in years, I fell asleep with something resembling hope. In 2015, 10 years into my sentence, the first crack appeared in the wall of corruption that had destroyed my life. I was eating breakfast in the chow hall when another inmate, a guy named Jimmy who worked in the warden's office, slid a newspaper, clipping across the table. "Thought you might want to see this," he said quietly. The headline made my hands shake. "Detective under investigation for evidence tampering." The article was small, buried on page 6 of the Metro section, but to me, it might as well have been front-page news. Detective Frank Rourke, a 20-year veteran of the police force, is being investigated by Internal Affairs following allegations that he may have tampered with evidence in multiple cases over the past decade. The investigation was prompted by complaints from defense attorneys who noticed irregularities in cases handled by Rourke. I read the article 12 times, memorizing every word. This was the first official acknowledgement that Rourke was dirty. After 10 years of screaming into the void about police corruption, someone was finally listening that afternoon. I called the reporter who had written the article, Patricia Keene. She was a crime reporter for the city newspaper who specialized in police misconduct stories. When I told her who I was and why I was calling, her interest was immediate. "Derek Lawson," she said, "I remember your case. The convenience store murder. You've been claiming innocence this whole time?" "I've been proving innocence this whole time. Detective Rourke framed me, and I can show you exactly how he did it." We talked for over an hour. I walked her through my case, pointing out all the irregularities that had never been properly investigated. The planted gun, the disappeared security footage, the coached witness, everything pointed to a systematic frame-up. "This fits a pattern I'm seeing," Patricia told me. "Rourke's name keeps coming up in cases where evidence was conveniently found or witnesses suddenly remembered important details. Can you send me everything you have?" Over the next month, I mailed her copies of everything: my legal notes, correspondence, case documents, timelines, witness statements. She spent weeks fact-checking my claims, interviewing people connected to my case, and digging into Rourke's other investigations. Word spread quickly through Millbrook that I might actually have a shot at proving my innocence. Other inmates started coming forward with their own stories about Detective Rourke. It turned out I wasn't his only victim. Carlos Mendez had been convicted of drug dealing based solely on Rourke's testimony about finding cocaine in his car. But Carlos had been at his daughter's school play when the alleged traffic stop occurred, with dozens of witnesses and video footage to prove it. Tommy Walsh had been convicted of assault after Rourke claimed he'd confessed during questioning. But Tommy was illiterate and couldn't have written the detailed confession that Rourke had submitted as evidence. Andre Jackson had been convicted of burglary after Rourke found stolen goods in his apartment. But Andre had been working a double shift at the hospital where he was employed as a janitor, with time clocks and security cameras documenting his presence. The pattern was becoming clear. Rourke had been systematically framing innocent people for years, targeting men who didn't have the resources to fight back effectively. Poor men, minority men, men without connections or political power. I started compiling a list of Rourke's questionable cases, documenting the similarities in his methods. Patricia Keene was doing the same thing from the outside, using her investigative skills and media connections to dig deeper into the corruption. "I'm finding irregularities in at least 15 cases that Rourke was involved in," she told me during one of our weekly phone calls. "The problem is proving it." Internal Affairs is being very tight-lipped about their investigation. But we weren't the only ones asking questions anymore. Defense attorneys around the city were reviewing old cases, looking for signs of Rourke's manipulation. Civil rights groups were getting involved. The story was getting bigger than just one corrupt cop. It was becoming about systemic problems in the justice system. Old C watched all of this unfold with the wisdom of someone who'd seen many prison crusades fail. Don't get your hopes up too high, young blood, he warned me. Powerful people protect each other. They got ways of making problems disappear. He was right to be cautious, but for the first time in 10 years, I felt like I was fighting back, instead of just surviving. The wall of corruption was still standing, but now it had a crack in it, and I intended to keep hammering at that crack until the whole thing came tumbling down. Patricia Keene's investigation gained momentum throughout 2016. What started as a simple story about one corrupt detective was evolving into something much larger and more sinister. During one of our regular phone calls, she shared news that made my blood run cold. Derek, I've been digging into Judge Patricia Henley's financial records. The woman who sentenced you has some interesting connections. Judge Henley, the woman who had looked me in the eye and sentenced me to 25 to life with what seemed like personal satisfaction. The woman who had ruled against every motion my lawyer made, no matter how reasonable. What kind of connections? She's been receiving payments from a consulting firm called Meridian Legal Services. Officially, it's for speaking engagements and legal seminars. Unofficially, Meridian Legal Services is owned by a shell company that traces back to some very interesting people. Patricia's research had uncovered a web of corruption that went far beyond one bad cop. Detective Rourke wasn't working alone. He was part of a network that included judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and court officials, all working together to manipulate the justice system for profit. The scheme was brilliant in its simplicity. Rourke would target defendants who fit a specific profile: poor, minority, no political connections, no resources to mount an effective defense. He would manufacture evidence, coach witnesses, and build airtight cases against innocent people. Judge Henley would ensure that these defendants got inadequate legal representation by appointing defense attorneys who were part of the conspiracy. These lawyers would provide just enough of a defense to avoid malpractice claims. While ensuring their clients were convicted, the prosecutors involved would fast-track these cases, avoiding the kind of thorough investigation that might uncover the truth. Everyone got paid, everyone stayed quiet, and innocent people rotted in prison. My case fit the pattern perfectly. Charles Brennan, my court-appointed attorney, had received over $200,000 in consulting fees from Meridian Legal Services in the years following my conviction. No wonder he'd been so eager to plea bargain, so reluctant to challenge the evidence, so quick to dismiss my claims of innocence. There's more, Patricia continued. I've been looking into that internal affairs report on Rourke. It's heavily redacted, but I was able to get some information through a source in the department. Rourke wasn't just taking money to frame innocent people, he was taking money to protect guilty ones. The corruption network worked both ways. For the right price, they would manufacture evidence against innocent targets. For an even higher price, they would make evidence against guilty clients disappear. They were literally selling justice to the highest bidder. Patricia had documented at least 20 cases where this network had operated, but she suspected there were many more. The financial records showed payments going back over 15 years, which meant hundreds of innocent people might be sitting in prison while hundreds of guilty people walked free. The FBI needs to see this, I told her during one of our calls. Already reached out to them, she said. But these cases cross multiple jurisdictions and some of the players are very well connected politically. It's going to take time to build a federal case. Time, always time. I'd already lost 11 years of my life to this conspiracy, and now I was being told that justice would take even more time. But things were accelerating whether the authorities wanted to or not. Other journalists picked up on Patricia's reporting, and the story began making headlines beyond the local newspapers. Defense attorneys across the state started reviewing old cases, looking for signs of the corruption network's involvement. The prison administration at Millbrook began restricting my access to legal materials and limiting my phone calls. They claimed it was for security reasons, but I knew the truth. Someone was getting nervous about my investigation and the attention it was attracting. Old C pulled me aside one day after lunch. "They moving you soon," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" "I got friends who work in administration. Word is they gonna transfer you to another facility, somewhere you can't cause trouble. You're getting too close to something big." That night, I called Patricia with the news. She immediately contacted the ACLU and several civil rights organizations, alerting them that I might be transferred to silence my investigation. "Don't worry," she told me. "You've got too much attention on you. Now for them to make you disappear. But be careful, Derek. These people have a lot to lose, and desperate people do desperate things." 2 days later, I was walking back from the library when 3 guards approached me. They were led by Sergeant Morrison, a brutal man who'd been at Millbrook for 20 years and had a reputation for violence against inmates. "Lawson, you're coming with us." "Where?" "Protective custody." "For your own safety." They weren't protecting me, they were isolating me. Protective custody at Millbrook was solitary confinement by another name. 23 hours a day in a concrete box, limited phone access, no visitors except lawyers. As they led me through the corridors toward the isolation unit, I caught glimpses of other inmates watching. Some looked sympathetic, others appeared relieved that the troublemaker was being removed. But in Old C's eyes, I saw something that gave me strength, respect. "Keep fighting, young blood," he called out as the heavy door slammed shut behind me. Truth's got a way of coming out. In that isolation cell, surrounded by concrete walls and the silence of forced solitude, I realized that my investigation had moved beyond just proving my own innocence. I was now threatening an entire criminal enterprise that had operated in shadows for over a decade. They could isolate my body, but they couldn't silence the truth. And that truth was about to explode into the light. The isolation didn't last as long as they'd hoped. Patricia Keene's articles had caught the attention of the National Innocence Project, and within 2 weeks of my transfer to protective custody, I received a letter that changed everything. "Dear Mr. Lawson," it began, "we have reviewed your case materials and believe there are substantial grounds for investigating your claims of actual innocence. We would like to formally accept your case for representation." The letter was signed by Samantha Quinn, a senior attorney with the Innocence Project who specialized in cases involving police misconduct. After 12 years of writing letters that went unanswered, someone with real power was finally listening. My first phone call with Samantha lasted 3 hours. She was thorough, methodical, and refreshingly direct about both the strengths and weaknesses of my case. "The good news is that your story has remained consistent over 12 years, and we found multiple irregularities in the original investigation," she told me. "The bad news is that most of the physical evidence has been lost or destroyed, and key witnesses have either died or disappeared." But Samantha had something my previous legal representation lacked: resources and expertise. The Innocence Project had a team of investigators, forensic experts, and legal researchers who could do the kind of comprehensive case review that had never been done during my original trial. "We're going to start by re-examining every piece of evidence from your case," she explained. "New DNA testing technology has advanced significantly since 2005. If there's any biological evidence that wasn't tested or was tested inadequately, we might be able to get results that could exclude you as the perpetrator." The investigation that followed was like watching professionals do the job that should have been done 13 years earlier. Samantha's team tracked down witnesses who had never been interviewed, found security footage that had been overlooked, and uncovered police reports that had been buried in the files. They also began building a comprehensive picture of Detective Rourke's pattern of misconduct. Working with Patricia Keene and other journalists, they documented case after case where Rourke had used similar tactics, planted evidence, coached witnesses, and manufactured confessions. "Your case isn't unique, Derek," Samantha told me during one of our calls. "It's part of a systematic pattern of corruption that actually works in our favor. because it shows that framing innocent people wasn't an isolated incident, it was Rourke's standard operating procedure. The community support that began building around my case was unlike anything I'd experienced during my original trial. Patricia Keene's articles had inspired dozens of people to come forward with information about corruption in the police department. And Court System, a group called Citizens for Justice Reform, organized rallies and petition drives demanding a full investigation of wrongful convictions in our city. They set up a website documenting my case and others like it, and they began raising money for additional legal representation. For the first time in over a decade, I felt like I had allies on the outside who were fighting as hard as I was fighting on the inside. These weren't just lawyers doing their job. These were people who genuinely believed in my innocence and were willing to put their time, money, and reputations on the line to help me. But the most significant development came when Samantha called me with news that made me literally weak in the knees. "Derek, we found biological evidence from the crime scene that was never tested for DNA. It's been sitting in the evidence locker for 13 years. If we can get a court order for testing, and if the sample is still viable, we might be able to prove your innocence definitively." After 13 years of circumstantial arguments and legal technicalities, we finally had a chance for scientific proof of my innocence. The evidence that could free me had been sitting in a box just miles from my prison cell this entire time. In 2017, while Samantha Quinn was fighting legal battles to get the DNA evidence tested, the federal investigation into police corruption reached a tipping point. Patricia Keene called me with news that sent shockwaves through Millbrook Correctional Facility. "Derek, the FBI has been conducting surveillance on Detective Rourke for the past 6 months. They have photographs of him accepting money from Tony Marcelli, a known associate of the Coslow crime family." The surveillance photo she described would later become Exhibit A in the federal case against Rourke. It showed him in a parking garage, accepting a briefcase from Marcelli while wearing a wire that he didn't know the FBI had compromised. But the truly devastating revelation came when federal investigators pieced together the real story behind Kumar Patel's murder. It wasn't a random robbery gone wrong. It was a targeted hit disguised as a convenience store robbery. Patel wasn't just a store owner, Patricia explained during one of our calls. He was laundering money for a rival crew that was moving in on Marcelli's territory. The murder was a message, and the robbery was just window dressing to throw off the investigation. The federal investigation revealed that Rourke had been on Marcelli's payroll for over a decade. His job wasn't just to frame innocent people, it was to protect the crime family's operations by misdirecting police investigations and ensuring that their enemies got convicted of crimes they didn't commit. I was chosen as a patsy for Kumar Patel's murder because I fit their requirements perfectly. I was young, poor, had some connection to the neighborhood where the crime occurred, and most importantly, I had no ties to organized crime that might complicate the frame. The gun they planted in my apartment had been used in the actual murder. But the real killer was Tony Marcelli's nephew, Vincent, who had died of a heroin overdose 3 years after my conviction. The crime family had been protecting a dead man while I rotted in prison for his crime. The federal wiretaps revealed conversations between Rourke and his handlers that made my blood boil. They discussed my case like it was a business transaction, calculating the cost of framing me against the benefit of protecting their real killer. "The kid's got no connections, no money for a real lawyer," Rourke's voice said on one recording. "Easy target. By the time anyone figures out what really happened, the statute of limitations will protect us." But they had underestimated both my determination and the power of the truth to eventually surface. The same federal investigation that was supposed to protect them was now documenting their crimes in meticulous detail. Judge Patricia Henley resigned from the bench in disgrace when her financial connections to the corruption network became public. The consulting fees she'd received from Meridian Legal Services were revealed to be bribes for ensuring that certain defendants received inadequate representation. Charles Brennan, my former court-appointed attorney, was arrested for conspiracy and fraud. The man who was supposed to defend me had been paid to ensure my conviction from the very beginning. Raj Patel, Kumar's brother who had identified me in the lineup, finally admitted under FBI questioning that Detective Rourke had coached him on what to say. Rourke had threatened to have him arrested for his gambling debts if he didn't cooperate, and promised to make those debts disappear if he identified me as the killer. I knew it wasn't right, Raj told federal investigators. But I was scared, and Rourke said the real killer would never be caught if I didn't help. He said Derek Lawson was probably guilty of something anyway. The network was collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. Federal agents were making arrests weekly, and the local news was dominated by stories of the conspiracy that had operated in plain sight for over 15 years. But for me, sitting in my cell at Millbrook, the most important development was still pending. Despite all the evidence of corruption, despite the federal indictments and resignations, I was still imprisoned serving a sentence for a crime I didn't commit. The wheels of justice turn slowly, Samantha Quinn reminded me during one of our calls. But they're turning. Your vindication is coming, Derek. It's just a matter of time. Time. I'd heard that word so many times over the past 13 years that it had lost all meaning. But for the first time since my conviction, time was working in my favor instead of against me. The stress of the investigation and the constant media attention began taking a physical toll on me that I hadn't anticipated. In March 2018 years into my sentence, I experienced what the prison medical report would later describe as a stress-induced cardiac episode. I was in my cell, reading through legal documents that Samantha had sent me, when suddenly my chest felt like it was being crushed by an invisible weight. My left arm went numb, and I couldn't catch my breath. For a terrifying moment, I thought I was having a heart attack. The prison medical staff rushed me to the infirmary, where they determined that while it wasn't a full cardiac event, my blood pressure was dangerously elevated and my heart was showing signs of severe stress. At 40 years old, my body was breaking down under the psychological pressure of fighting for my freedom while trapped in a concrete cage. You need to find ways to manage your stress, Dr. Patricia Foster, the prison physician, told me as I lay hooked up to monitors in the medical ward. Your body can't sustain this level of anxiety indefinitely. But managing stress was impossible when I was receiving death threats from guards who were connected to the corruption network. Word had leaked that I was cooperating with federal investigators. And suddenly I was seen as a threat that needed to be eliminated. The threats weren't subtle. Guards would accidentally forget to deliver my meals, leave my cell door unlocked in dangerous areas of the prison, or make comments about how unfortunate it would be if something happened to me before my case was resolved. Sergeant Morrison, the brutal guard who had put me in protective custody, was the most direct. During one of his inspections of my cell, he leaned close and whispered, "Lot of accidents happen in prison, Lawson. Be a shame if you didn't live to see your precious vindication." The warden eventually had to place me in protective custody. Again, not to silence me this time, but to keep me alive. The isolation was maddening. But it was better than being murdered by corrupt guards trying to protect their conspiracy. Old C managed to get a message to me through the prison chaplain. "Stay strong, young blood," the message said. "They only threatening you because they scared. Scared people make mistakes." He was right. The harassment was actually evidence that my investigation was working. If I was really just a delusional inmate chasing impossible dreams, they wouldn't bother trying to silence me. But the physical and emotional toll was becoming unbearable. I'd lost 30 pounds since the federal investigation began. My hair was turning gray at 40, and I'd developed a tremor in my hands from the constant stress. During one particularly dark night in protective custody, I found myself wondering if I would survive long enough to see vindication. 13 years in prison had already aged me beyond my years, and the stress of the investigation was accelerating that process. I wrote a letter to Samantha Quinn that night, asking her what would happen to the case if something happened to me. Her response was swift and reassuring. "Derek, nothing is going to happen to you. You have too much attention on your case now for anyone to risk harming you, and even if the worst happened, the truth about your innocence would still come out. Your story has inspired too many people for it to be buried now." She was right about the attention. My case had become a symbol of wrongful conviction and police corruption, covered by national news outlets and discussed in law schools across the country. I wasn't just fighting for my own freedom anymore, I was fighting for every innocent person who had been destroyed by the corruption network. That realization gave me the strength to endure the isolation, the threats, and the physical deterioration. I wasn't just Derek Lawson, inmate number 47,291 anymore. I was the living proof that the system could be corrupted, and my vindication would be proof that the truth could still prevail. The breaking point I thought might destroy me actually made me stronger, because I finally understood that my fight was bigger than just my own life. On September 14, 2018, the House of Cards finally collapsed. I was in the prison library when the news broke. Detective Frank Rourke had been arrested by federal agents on 47 separate charges, including evidence tampering, conspiracy, bribery, and accessory to murder. The grand jury indictment read like a catalog of corruption spanning 15 years. Rourke wasn't just a dirty cop. He was the linchpin of a criminal enterprise that had perverted justice for profit and destroyed countless innocent lives. The federal charges were devastating in their scope. Rourke was accused of planting evidence in dozens of cases, coaching witnesses to provide false testimony, accepting bribes to protect criminals, and participating in a conspiracy to obstruct justice. The FBI had recorded phone conversations, documented financial transactions, and gathered testimony from multiple co-conspirators, but it was the specific charges related to my case that vindicated everything I'd been saying for 13 years. The indictment stated that Rourke had knowingly and willfully planted a murder weapon in the defendant's residence and suborned perjury by coaching a witness to provide false identification testimony. Patricia Keene called me within hours of the arrest. "Derek, they got him. They got all of them." Judge Patricia Henley had already resigned in disgrace, but now she faced criminal charges for accepting bribes and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The consulting fees she'd received from Meridian Legal Services were revealed to be payments for ensuring that certain defendants received inadequate representation and harsh sentences. Charles Brennan, my former court-appointed attorney, was arrested the same day as Rourke. The man who was supposed to defend me had been paid $200,000 over 5 years to ensure my conviction. His incompetent defense wasn't incompetence at all. It was calculated sabotage. The media coverage was unlike anything I'd ever seen. My case became the lead story on every local news station and was featured in national newspapers. The corruption scandal was being called the largest judicial conspiracy in the state's history. But beyond the headlines and arrests, the most important development was happening in the legal system. District Attorney Monica Sheffield, who had prosecuted my case with such certainty 13 years earlier, held a press conference announcing that her office was reviewing every case that Rourke had been involved with. "We have a responsibility to ensure that justice is served, even when that means admitting that our system failed," she said, looking directly into the cameras. "If innocent people are in prison because of this corruption, we will move heaven and earth to free them." The review of my case was expedited given the overwhelming evidence of misconduct. Samantha Quinn filed a motion for immediate release based on prosecutorial misconduct and newly discovered evidence of actual innocence. The government's own investigation has proven beyond any doubt that Derek Lawson was framed by corrupt law enforcement officials. Her motion stated, "He has served 13 years for a crime he did not commit, and his continued incarceration is a travesty of justice. Prison officials moved me out of protective custody and back into the general population as the corruption charges made it clear that I was the victim, not a troublemaker. The guards who had been threatening me were suddenly respectful, even apologetic. Other inmates at Millbrook, who had been skeptical of my claims for years, began approaching me with apologies and expressions of support. Men who had dismissed me as a delusional jailhouse lawyer now recognized that I'd been telling the truth all along. Old C, now 78 years old and in declining health, was the most emotional. "I always believed you, young blood," he told me with tears in his eyes. "But seeing it proven in court, that's something special. Your mama would be so proud." The federal investigation had exposed a network of corruption that reached into every level of the justice system. Police officers, judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, court clerks. And even some prison officials had been part of a conspiracy that had operated for over 15 years, but as satisfying as it was to see the corrupt officials finally facing justice, I was still sitting in a prison cell. The indictments were just the beginning. Now came the hard work of actually proving my innocence in court and securing my freedom. Samantha assured me that my release was imminent. The evidence is overwhelming, Derek. The DNA results should be back any day, and when they exclude you as the source, your vindication will be complete. After 13 years of fighting, victory was finally within reach. The call came on November 8, 2018, exactly 13 and a half years after Kumar Patel's murder. I was sitting in my cell, reading one of the legal briefs Samantha had sent me when the guard appeared at my door. "Lawson, you've got a call." "Legal." My hands were shaking as I picked up the phone in the attorney conference room. Samantha's voice was different, lighter, almost giddy with excitement. "Derek, we got the results. The DNA evidence definitively excludes you as the source. You are completely exonerated." The DNA exoneration report was 8 pages of scientific data that translated into the simplest truth imaginable. I didn't kill Kumar Patel. The biological evidence found at the crime scene, blood, saliva, and skin cells that had been preserved for over 13 years, came from someone else entirely. More than that, the DNA profile matched Vincent Marcelli, Tony Marcelli's nephew, who had died of a heroin overdose in 2008. The man I'd been imprisoned for killing had been dead for a decade, taking his secret to the grave while I served his sentence. "There's more," Samantha continued. "The FBI found video evidence that Detective Rourke planted the gun in your apartment. They have him on surveillance footage entering your building with a small package and leaving empty-handed 20 minutes later. The video had been captured by a security camera in the building across the street, a camera that Charles Brennan had never bothered to check during his investigation of my case. It showed Rourke clearly entering my building at 2:30 a.m., 3 days before my arrest, carrying what appeared to be the murder weapon. Every piece of evidence that had convicted me was finally revealed as fabricated. The gun with my alleged fingerprints planted by Rourke while I slept. The eyewitness identification coerced through threats and promises. The missing alibi evidence deliberately destroyed to ensure my conviction. "Derek," Samantha said, her voice thick with emotion. "In 30 years of practicing law, I've never seen a case where an innocent person was more systematically framed. What they did to you was evil." The formal exoneration process moved quickly. Once the DNA results were official, District Attorney Monica Sheffield personally filed the motion to vacate my conviction, acknowledging that the state had grievously wronged an innocent man through the criminal actions of corrupt officials. Judge Harrison Wells, who had replaced the disgraced Patricia Henley, scheduled an emergency hearing for November 15th. After 13 and a half years of imprisonment, I would finally have my day in court as a free man. The media attention around my exoneration was intense. Patricia Keene, the journalist who had first believed my story, was there when the official announcement was made. "Derek Lawson's case represents the worst fears about our justice system," she wrote in her front-page story. "An innocent man was systematically framed by the very people sworn to protect society, then abandoned by a system that failed to recognize its own corruption." Other victims of the corruption network began coming forward as my vindication made headlines. Carlos Mendez, Tommy Walsh, Andre Jackson, all the men whose stories I'd documented during my years of investigation were having their cases reviewed based on the evidence uncovered in the federal investigation. My vindication wasn't just about my own freedom anymore. It was proof that the entire conspiracy was real, that dozens of innocent people had been destroyed by a criminal enterprise operating within the justice system. The night before my release hearing, I lay in my cell for what I hoped would be the last time, thinking about my mother. She had died believing I was a killer, never knowing that her faith in my innocence had been justified all along. "I wish you could see this, Mama," I whispered into the darkness. "I wish you could know that. You raised a good son after all." Old C, who had been moved to the medical ward due to his declining health, sent me a message through another inmate. "Your mama knows, young blood. She's been watching over you this whole time, waiting for this day." Tomorrow I would walk out. of Millbrook Correctional Facility as a free man. But more importantly, I would walk out as a vindicated man, living proof that truth really can prevail, even against the most powerful forces of corruption. November 15th, 2018. The date is burned into my memory like a brand. After 13 years, 7 months, and 28 days in prison, I walked through the gates of Millbrook Correctional Facility as a free man, the release papers in my hand. Was simple a single sheet that officially ended my nightmare. Derek Lawson is hereby released from custody, all charges dismissed, conviction vacated due to actual innocence. 23 words that gave me back my life. The world outside looked different than it had in 2005. The cars were sleeker. Everyone carried small computers in their pockets, and the skyline had changed with new buildings reaching toward the clouds. I stood on the sidewalk outside the prison, overwhelmed by the simple reality of being able to walk in any direction. I chose. Samantha Quinn was waiting for me with a small crowd of supporters: Patricia Keene, members of Citizens for Justice, Reform, and several other exonerees who had fought similar battles. But the person I was most grateful to see was my Aunt Helen, my mother's sister, who had never stopped believing in my innocence. "Welcome home, baby," she said, embracing me, with tears streaming down her face. "Your mama would be so proud." The media circus was intense but respectful. Reporters shouted questions as we walked to Samantha's car, but I wasn't ready to speak publicly yet. The sensory overload of freedom was almost overwhelming: the sounds of traffic, the smell of autumn air, the feeling of sunlight on my face, without bars casting shadows. My first meal as a free man was at a small diner not far from the prison. Everything tasted different than I remembered. The coffee was richer, the bacon more flavorful, even the simple eggs seemed like a luxury after years of prison food. "Take your time adjusting," Samantha advised me over lunch. A lot of exonerees struggle with the transition. 13 years is a long time to be away from the world. That afternoon, I did something I'd been waiting 13 years to do. I visited my mother's grave. Mount Calvary Cemetery looked smaller than I remembered, but her headstone was exactly as I'd pictured it during all those years of being unable to say goodbye. Martha Lawson, beloved mother, 1948 to 2007. I knelt beside the grave and placed a bouquet of roses on the weathered stone. "I'm sorry it took so long, Mama," I whispered. "But you were right. The truth did come out." The official apology came that evening. Governor Patricia Hayes held a press conference, acknowledging the state's failure and offering a formal apology for my wrongful conviction. "Derek Lawson suffered an injustice that shakes the very foundation of our legal system," she said. "No apology can give him back the 13 years that were stolen from him. But the state of New York formally acknowledges his innocence and our responsibility for this tragedy." The governor also announced the formation of a commission to review other cases potentially affected by the corruption network and to implement reforms designed to prevent similar injustices in the future. But beyond the official apologies and political gestures, the most profound moment of my first day of freedom came that night. I was staying in a hotel room, the first time I'd been alone in a space I could leave whenever I wanted in over 13 years. I stood at the window, looking out at the city lights, and realized that I was no longer prisoner number 47,291. I was Derek Lawson again, a man with a future, a purpose, and the freedom to make choices about my own life. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. I had no savings, no career, no relationships outside of the legal team that had fought for my freedom. I was 41 years old with a 13-year gap in my life that could never be filled, but I was free. I was vindicated and I was alive. For the first time since March 16, 2005, that was enough. 6 months after my release, I filed a $50 million civil lawsuit against the city, the police department, and every official who had participated in framing me. The lawsuit wasn't just about compensation, it was about accountability and ensuring that this kind of systemic corruption could never happen again. The legal filing was 200 pages long, documenting every aspect of the conspiracy that had destroyed my life. Samantha Quinn, who continued representing me in the civil case, made it clear that we weren't just seeking money, we were seeking justice for everyone who had been victimized by the corruption network. This lawsuit is about more than Derek Lawson, she told reporters at the press conference announcing the filing. It's about holding accountable a system that allowed innocent people to be framed while guilty people walked free. The discovery process revealed even more evidence of the conspiracy's scope. Internal police department emails showed that supervisors had ignored complaints about Detective Rourke's methods for years. Court records revealed that Judge Patricia Henley had received over $500,000 in bribes disguised as consulting fees. Financial documents showed that the corruption network had generated millions of dollars in illegal profits. But my primary focus wasn't on the money, it was on helping other victims of the conspiracy. Working with the Innocence Project and Citizens for Justice Reform, I helped establish a task force to review every case that the corrupt officials had been involved with. Carlos Mendez was exonerated 3 months after me when video evidence proved he'd been at his daughter's school play during the alleged drug deal. Tommy Walsh was released when handwriting analysis proved he couldn't have written the confession that Detective Rourke had attributed to him. Andre Jackson's conviction was overturned when time clock records showed he'd been at work during the burglary he was accused of committing. Each exoneration felt like a personal victory. These men had spent years in prison, their lives destroyed by the same corruption that had nearly destroyed mine. Seeing them walk free, reuniting with their families, starting to rebuild their lives, it gave meaning to everything I'd suffered. The most satisfying moment came when Detective Frank Rourke was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. I attended his sentencing hearing, sitting in the gallery as the judge read the charges against him. Frank Rourke, you have been found guilty of 47 separate felonies involving the systematic corruption of the justice system. Judge Harrison Wells said, your actions destroyed innocent lives, protected criminals, and undermined the very foundation of law and order. You will spend the rest of your life in prison, where you belong. When Rourke was led away in shackles, he looked directly at me. There was no remorse in his eyes, no acknowledgement of the lives he'd destroyed. But there was something else, fear. He was about to experience the same nightmare he'd inflicted on dozens of innocent people. Judge Patricia Henley received 15 years for her role in the conspiracy. Charles Brennan, my former court-appointed attorney, was sentenced to 10 years and disbarred permanently. Raj Patel, who had falsely identified me, received probation in exchange for his cooperation with federal investigators. The civil lawsuit settlement exceeded even our most optimistic expectations. The city agreed to pay $45 million to avoid a trial that would have exposed even more embarrassing details about the corruption. But more importantly, they agreed to implement comprehensive reforms designed to prevent future wrongful convictions. This settlement represents the largest wrongful conviction payout in state history, Samantha announced at the press conference. But Derek Lawson didn't fight for 13 years just for money. He fought for justice, and that's what we've achieved today. The money allowed me to establish the Martha Lawson Foundation for Wrongful Conviction Victims, named after my mother, who had died believing in my innocence. The foundation provides legal assistance, financial support, and counseling services to people who have been wrongfully convicted and their families. Our first major initiative was funding a comprehensive review of every murder case in the city from 1995 to 2015, looking for signs of the corruption network's involvement. We discovered 12 additional cases where innocent people had likely been framed, and we began working to secure their freedom. Working with other exonerees gave me a sense of purpose that I'd never experienced before. These weren't just legal cases, they were human lives that had been destroyed by the same evil that had nearly destroyed mine. Every person we helped free, every family we reunited, every life we restored felt like a victory against the forces of corruption. But the most meaningful work was preventive. The foundation began training defense attorneys to recognize signs of police misconduct, educating judges about the tactics used by corrupt officials, and working with lawmakers to pass legislation strengthening protections for defendants. Derek Lawson turned his personal tragedy into a force for justice, Patricia Keene wrote in a follow-up article 5 years after my release. His foundation has helped free dozens of innocent people and prevented countless others from being wrongfully convicted. The foundation also provided something I'd never had during my own ordeal: hope. When someone was arrested and claimed innocence, when their family faced the nightmare of watching a loved one being framed, when the system seemed hopeless and corrupt, we were there to fight alongside them. My testimony at Detective Rourke's trial was the culmination of 15 years of fighting for justice. Standing in that courtroom, looking at the man who had destroyed my life, I felt a sense of closure that I'd never thought possible. Frank Rourke didn't just steal 13 years of my life, I told the jury during my victim impact statement. He stole my mother's peace of mind, my chance to say goodbye to her, and my faith in the system I'd been raised to respect. But what he couldn't steal was the truth, and today that truth has set not just me free, but dozens of other innocent people as well. The Foundation's work expanded beyond individual cases to systemic reform. We lobbied for mandatory recording of all police interrogations, improved forensic evidence storage procedures, and stricter oversight of court-appointed attorneys. Each victory felt like justice, not just for the people we helped, but for my mother, who had died believing in a truth that took 13 years to prove. Rebuilding a life after 13 years in prison was harder than I'd expected. The world had changed dramatically during my incarceration, and I often felt like a time traveler trying to navigate a foreign landscape. Technology was the most obvious difference. Everyone carried smartphones that were more powerful than the computer's eye. Remembered from 2005, social media had transformed how people communicated and shared information. Even simple tasks like using an ATM or ordering food had become digitized in ways that left me feeling helpless and frustrated. The Martha Lawson Foundation hired a life coach to help me adjust to freedom, but some challenges couldn't be solved with professional assistance. I had no credit history, no recent work experience, no relationships outside of the legal team that had fought for my freedom. At 42 years old, I was starting over from scratch. The most difficult adjustment was learning to be alone without being isolated. In prison, you're never truly alone. There's always noise, always the presence of other people, always the structured routine of institutional life. Freedom meant having to make choices about how to spend every hour of every day, and that responsibility was overwhelming. I rented a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood, far from the area where Kumar Patel had been murdered. My first night there, I couldn't sleep because of the silence. I'd grown so accustomed to the constant noise of prison that complete quiet felt unnatural, almost threatening. But slowly, with the help of trauma counselors and the support of other exonerees, I began to heal. The Foundation's work gave me purpose, but I also started rebuilding personal relationships and exploring interests that I'd had to abandon during my imprisonment. I began dating again, something I'd never thought would be possible. Sarah Chun, a social worker who volunteered with the Foundation, became first a friend, then something more. She understood the challenges of helping people rebuild their lives after trauma, and she had the patience to help me navigate the complexities of intimate relationships after years of enforced isolation. "You don't have to explain your past to everyone," she told me during one of our early conversations. "But you can't hide from it either. What happened to you is part of who you are, but it doesn't define your future." The Foundation's success created opportunities I'd never imagined. During my years in prison, I was invited to speak at law schools, conferences, and legislative hearings about wrongful convictions and criminal justice reform. My story became a case study in criminal justice courses and a symbol of both the system's failures and its capacity for redemption. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Clarence Washington, Old C., was released on compassionate grounds due to his terminal cancer diagnosis. At 84, he had spent over 40 years in prison, but he lived long enough to see me vindicated and free. "You did it, young blood," he said. When I visited him in the hospice facility, "You proved that truth can win, even against impossible odds. Your mama would be so proud." He died peacefully 2 weeks later, surrounded by the prison reform advocates who had become his chosen family. At his funeral, I realized that he had given me something invaluable during my darkest years: the wisdom to survive with dignity, and the faith to believe that justice was possible. The settlement from my civil lawsuit allowed me financial security I'd never known, but money couldn't restore the years I'd lost. I would never get to hold my mother's hand as she died, never experience my 30s as a free man, never build the career and family that should have been mine during those stolen years, yet I found peace in the knowledge that my suffering had meaning. Every innocent person the Foundation helped free, every reform we achieved, every corruption scandal we exposed was vindication not just for me, but for everyone who had been destroyed by a system that valued convictions over truth. The Derek Lawson who walked out of prison in 2018 was fundamentally different from the naive 27-year-old who had been arrested in 2005. Prison had hardened me, aged me, and scarred me in ways that would never fully heal. But it had also taught me resilience, patience, and the power of never giving up on the truth. 5 years after my release, I stood before Congress to testify about criminal justice reform. The marble halls of the Capitol building felt surreal, a far cry from the concrete corridors of Millbrook Correctional Facility where I'd spent 13 years fighting for this moment. Honorable members of Congress, I began, looking out at the assembled representatives. My name is Derek Lawson, and I am here today not as a victim but as a survivor and an advocate for justice. My testimony focused on the comprehensive reforms needed to prevent wrongful convictions. I spoke about mandatory recording of all police interrogations, improved forensic evidence storage, better training for court-appointed attorneys, and stronger oversight of prosecutorial conduct. The corruption that destroyed my life wasn't the work of a few bad actors, I explained to the Congressional Committee. It was a systematic failure that allowed innocent people to be framed while guilty people walked free. Reform isn't just about fixing individual cases, it's about restoring faith in the justice system itself. The lawmakers listened intently as I described the Martha Lawson Foundation's work and the dozens of innocent people we'd helped free. I told them about Carlos Mendez, who had missed his daughter's childhood while serving time for a crime he didn't commit. I spoke about Tommy Walsh, whose illiteracy had been exploited to create false confessions. I described Andre Jackson, whose solid alibi had been ignored by corrupt officials. These aren't statistics, I said. These are human lives that were destroyed by a system that valued convictions over truth. We can do better, and we must do better. 6 months later, Congress passed the Derek Lawson Wrongful Conviction Prevention Act, the most comprehensive criminal justice reform legislation in decades. The law mandated recording of all police interrogations, created national standards for forensic evidence handling, established independent oversight of prosecutorial conduct, and provided federal funding for post-conviction DNA testing. Derek Lawson's courage and persistence have made our justice system stronger, said Senator Patricia Williams during the bill's signing ceremony. This legislation will prevent future tragedies and help restore public faith in American justice. But the most meaningful recognition came not from Congress, but from my local community. The city renamed the street where Kumar Patel's store had stood Truth and Justice Way, with a plaque honoring both Patel's memory and the importance of fighting for actual innocence. The Martha Lawson Foundation had grown into a national organization with offices in 12 states and a staff of over 50 attorneys, investigators, and support personnel. We'd helped secure the freedom of 127 wrongfully convicted individuals and prevented countless others from being falsely imprisoned through our training programs and advocacy work. My mother's name was permanently attached to this legacy of justice, ensuring that her faith in my innocence would be remembered alongside every person we helped free. The Foundation's charter, displayed in our headquarters, included her words from that final letter: "Keep fighting, baby. Keep believing. The truth will come out someday." At 50 years old, I had found a purpose I never could have imagined during those dark years in prison. The Congressional Medal of Courage, presented to me by the President for my work in criminal justice reform, sat on my desk as a reminder that suffering could be transformed into service. The corruption network that had destroyed my youth was completely dismantled. Detective Frank Rourke died in prison, taking his secrets and his hatred to the grave. Judge Patricia Henley lost her pension and her freedom. Charles Brennan was disbarred and forgotten. The criminal enterprise that had operated for 15 years was exposed, prosecuted, and eliminated, but their defeat wasn't just about punishment, it was about prevention. The reforms we'd achieved meant that future Derek Lawsons would have better protection, faster paths to vindication, and stronger support systems during their fights for freedom, standing in my office. Looking at photographs of all the innocent people we'd helped free, I thought about that terrified 27-year-old who had been arrested for a crime he didn't commit. He couldn't have imagined that his nightmare would become the foundation for helping hundreds of others avoid the same fate. The truth had come out, just as my mother had promised. Justice had been served not through revenge, but through reform. And her legacy, our legacy, would continue, protecting innocent people for generations to come. Sometimes justice doesn't just knock, it builds a foundation that can never be shaken again.